Otherwise, please feel free to hide yourself away behind your screen if you would prefer. So our agenda this afternoon, the last time we met in October, we decided on a focus for today, looking at authentic and purposeful writing across the AOLE. And so this afternoon, we're going to start the afternoon by looking at a new resource that comes from us in the team, a new text types overview. We're then going to think about what authentic writing in humanities looks like, as I say, with our curriculum partner, Bridie. I'm really delighted that Hannah from Glanhusk Primary is joining us this afternoon to talk about the work that is still ongoing in their school to develop authentic, purposeful writing. And then at the end of the afternoon, I'll just point you in the direction and a reminder of some additional resources. So let's carry on. In beginning, I think perhaps middle of last week, Estyn published their report on the state of education and training across Wales from their findings during inspections of the last year. The report that you can see an extract on the screen there details what's going well and what needs to improve for each sector of education, as well as providing guidance on how to improve. So on the slide there is an extract which is concerned with cross-curricular skills. So what Estyn have found across the range of primary schools that were inspected in 2023-24 was that good progress has been seen in writing in many schools. It goes on at the end of the extract there to talk about a couple of specific areas that they've highlighted really for improvement. As it says there, although in many schools, pupils make good progress in writing, teachers did not always provide opportunities for people to strengthen their work well enough, for example, by addressing repeating errors, or by allowing pupils the time to craft their work effectively for authentic purposes and audiences. And I think it's interesting that it's picking up on two aspects there. Firstly, the struggle that is real in many of our schools in the region, which is about improving that basic accuracy, those basic skills that still plague many of our young writers, but also the importance in providing time to develop the skills required for those authentic purposes and audiences. So I wonder whether this reflects some of the work that you're doing in your own schools. So before we think about cross-curricular authentic opportunities for writing, I thought it would be important to start first of all with our English curriculum, how it is we plan to develop our pupils' writing when we first teach those writing skills in English. So last year, 2023-24, our team offered a series of professional learning sessions looking at considerations for school in designing your English curriculum as part of your LLC. During the course, we referred to the principles of progression to consider how schools might develop a deepening understanding of ideas and concepts in English. Sorry, I'm slightly distracted by a message in the chat. Leanne, is that you? We're not seeing anything.
No.
Okay. Okay. Apologies. I think I've just let somebody in. I'll carry on. So as I was saying, during the course last year, we looked in particular at the principles of progression, and we tried to consider over a series of days how schools might develop a deepening understanding of the ideas, those main concepts in English, through the primary phase and then on into the secondary for that full continuum from progression step 1 to progression step 5. In addition, we thought then about how do we go on to plan for increasing breadth and depth of knowledge associated with these concepts, and how do we then plan for the development of those key skills, particularly for today, in relation to pupils' writing through that primary phase and then on into the secondary phase, so that it's a seamless progression and transition through primary into secondary. It became really clear across the working party of primary and secondary teachers of English that actually the range of purposes for writing that we use in primary for English and those that are used in secondary English departments were not necessarily progressive. It became quite clear that actually the types of purposes and text types we're using in primary, in some cases, were quite different to those that were being referred to in secondary. And so as part of that curriculum work, we created what we were calling the text type overview. An overview that looks at what text types and purposes for writing do we want to provide for progression step 1 through to 5, providing a common language and common purposes in order to further support that progressive journey for our pupils. And what we came up with was the EAS text types overview. So you should be able to see that on your screen now, and in a moment I'll put a link to that in the chat so that you can access it directly if that's useful. So here we have the overview, and the top row, across that top row, are listed the main text types for English in the first place, from, as I say, progression step 1 right through to progression step 5. From the left-hand side, working our way across, the text types are there to describe factual non-fiction writing. That the text type of argumentation, under which the purpose is to argue, to persuade, or to advise, sit underneath that umbrella. The next text type of analysis, the umbrella through which the purpose of writing to analyse, writing to review, writing to evaluate might sit. And then we have the text type exposition. And for those schools who have engaged over the last 3 years in the Writing Revolution training, which we know has been massively successful in the schools where they've trialled approaches, the term exposition will be familiar to you. Exposition, the umbrella term for writing where the purpose is to inform or to explain or perhaps to explore, all common under that term of exposition. And then instructional, where that particular purpose is, as we described, to provide instructions to help somebody undertake a task. And then finally, in that factual non-fiction section, that category of transactional. And then on the right-hand side of our grid, we have the text types for the more creative, imaginative writing. The text types of narration and description, linked together here by the fact that they are particularly a focus of our English teaching, and particularly related to the writing skills and reading associated with creativity and imagination. So writing to narrate for the purpose of entertaining, I beg your pardon, for the purpose of imagining and describing, associated with fiction. And finally, the category, that text type of description, where we're asking perhaps our pupils to write to imagine, to entertain, to describe, but often in a non-fiction form, perhaps writing with a basis of factual information, but using the skills of that lovely expressive language in order to, as I say, imagine, explain, or describe. So on the left-hand side, the categories of text types which lend themselves to factual non-fiction writing, whereas on the right-hand side, more fictional writing, engaging with creative and imaginative writing in particular. So if we take a look at one of those in a little bit more detail, if we just consider narration, we're very familiar in the primary phase with engaging our children in writing with a focus to narrate, to imagine, entertain, to describe, and in relation to fiction. Perhaps to give you some examples, if we're asking children to use writing to imagine, describe, or entertain around narrative, we may well be engaging children in the types of forms of writing that vary, but always with the same purposes. So, as you can see on the screen there from some of those examples, which I'm sure will look really familiar, we might be asking children to write in the form of a diary, or in the form of a letter, or in a poetic form, or maybe even in the form of an interview. But always the children will be using figurative devices such as similes and metaphors, going beyond the literal meaning to write with sumptuous, imaginative, and symbolic language. If we go on to think about that description column, where we might be giving children opportunities to imagine, entertain, and describe, but in more non-fiction forms of writing. Here, we're asking them to borrow from perhaps storytelling language, to again use the range of figurative language, of rich details, of sensory description, to tell what might be coming from true stories. So in terms of examples, that might be what we classically think of as children drawing on their knowledge, perhaps of science, or drawing on their knowledge of humanities or expressive arts, but using that then to write descriptively about someone or somewhere or something. So, as I say, drawing often on that knowledge from the other curriculum areas, but the purposes for these writing are around writing to imagine, or writing to entertain the reader, or to describe, but not from that first-hand situation. So again, it might be in the form of a diary or a journal or a letter. But always with that element of trying to imagine, entertain, and describe. So having said all that, a lot of those types and purposes of writing sit very clearly in our remit for our English language teaching, focusing on narrative, focusing on the development of complex sentences to engage and describe and use those lovely language features. But also in English, we provide those opportunities for those more non-fiction factual writing, where children are going to be exploring the purposes for reading and for writing of non-fiction. Here, the purpose of the writing dictates the features of the language and of the organisation. So, on the left-hand side, to argue, to persuade and advise, where we ask children to write, to argue a particular point of view, or to express a particular point of view based in fact. To analyse, where we ask pupils to provide perhaps a written personal response to text, where they're looking at the features of that text. They're perhaps analysing the features of a text. They might be responding to character, to theme, to setting. They might be comparing texts. And by thinking about the parts of the text, summarising, offering opinions, and thinking about the quality of those texts, then we're looking at that strand of writing to analyse or review or evaluate. The exposition text type then has that umbrella around writing to inform with knowledge from perhaps other areas of the curriculum. So writing information or to provide reasons behind that information to explain. Writing to instruct, I think we're very comfortable with in the primary as well. Writing instructions to support the reader in undertaking a task, being clear and concise and accurate. And finally then that additional column for non-fiction writing, transactional, perhaps a term that we might not use as much, but thinking about those short, sharp writing opportunities where often set in a kind of social purpose, a short, sharp email to arrange, a short, sharp note to organise a meeting, that transactional column. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop a link in the chat that will give you access to that document. And what I'll do is I will allocate you some time to go into those breakout rooms and perhaps just give you some opportunity to reflect on that text type overview. Just hang on for everyone to come back in. Fantastic. Well, I hope you've had enough chance to speak to each other. There'll be more opportunity for any feedback from any of the breakout rooms. Any potential for use for that kind of resource? Other things in place already in your own schools or perhaps within your cluster support that idea about text types or purposes for writing?
Kath, you want to just make, like, at GLANESC, obviously, as we'll talk about a little bit later.
Thanks, Hannah.
We already have, we're trying to embed the text types, but through literacy. And what we realised that when we came on the PL with Bridie and yourself is that we do have a little bit of a gap in terms of the text types that we're looking at in that, well, in the framework that we have, I guess, because it's very literacy English based, which then obviously leaves a bit of exposure to writing across other areas in an extended way. So this actually helps to see that. But for us, it's just now kind of making sure that they complement the two so we don't overload staff.
Yeah.
But it's got a real good place, I think, going forward. It's got that clarity, isn't it, in terms of how that can look.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. That's an interesting thought. Any other conversations similar, different from the other groups? Hi, Claire. I can see you, but I can't hear you.
Let me go again. Sorry, Kat.
Perfect. Thanks, Claire.
Brain switched on. Yeah, the general consensus from the group was that, you know, it's really useful to have it all in one place. Somebody was saying about, you know, it's a piece of work that she's been trying to do sort of independently. It was quite hard work. So having that in one document where it's really clear and concise is really helpful starting place to then build on and move forward. Lots of schools have got genres in place and maybe need to now look at this as a new framework to support them moving forward. But the general consensus is really, really handy.
Great. Thanks, Claire. That's interesting. It's interesting to pick up on the term genre as well, because I know for years and years as a team, we've been sharing materials and resources referring to genre. And that was another reason why we wanted to create this text types overview to make the distinction. So text types talking about umbrella for purposes for writing, whereas genre, probably a term that we should mainly keep when we're thinking about the specific styles that perhaps sit underneath that kind of fiction and narrative umbrella in particular. And so again, it might be that just confirmation of the terms that we're using, to try and have similar terms that go from the primary into the secondary, because that the use of that term genre again is one that is used in different ways currently in the primary and the secondary. So hopefully it might be that the starting point for a conversation to have to think about that commonality for the terminology as well. Thanks for that. Any other issues that have come up, or conversations around that, the text types from any of the other groups? Okay, so if we just move on then, and so we were thinking about that those range of text types are very much our teaching and learning in English, thinking about how we introduce those purposes for writing, how we support children to analyse text and identify those purposes in their reading, and then to develop those particular language features associated with that range of text types in their writing as well. But this text type overview also provides a support for thinking about the application of that writing across the range of areas of learning and experience. I thought it would be interesting to look at what the curriculum documentation tells us about thinking about literacy skills across the curriculum. And so just as a way into this, if we think about expressive arts, and if we look into expressive arts, they suggest in their designing the curriculum section of the AOLE that the particular opportunities that I think lend themselves to writing. So for example, in expressive arts, learners develop skills essential for critical analysis, so that they can use language receptively, but also expressively. And one would think that might include, as appropriate with the age and stage of the children in their writing, children being able to explore and be exposed to creative work, and thinking about the reading skills that they use to access that. But also that might lend itself to noting that in a written form. Students in expressive arts using their skills and their knowledge with a particular audience and purpose, and that would include as well in the written form, and using the knowledge and skills and expressive arts to help them build their confidence to express themselves. And I guess that particularly lends itself in that kind of more dramatic form as well. So we might argue that in expressive arts, if we're thinking about text types and purposes for authentic writing and expressive art, might it lend itself to writing to analyse in expressive arts, where using that analysing art and then writing it, analysing what they've read and understood and using that perhaps in a written form? Might they also, if they're developing language for purpose and audience and building their confidence expressively and creatively, might they also be writing to narrate, to describe, entertain, and imagine? So whilst we're thinking about our English curriculum, application of these purposes might sit very authentically in the areas of learning and experience. And that you will have accessible through the slides also features colleagues from the breadth of our curriculum team here at the EAS, and their thoughts on how writing authentic opportunities for writing in their own AOLE might look in relation to those text types. So as you can see on the screen there, when we think about analysis, so writing to review, to analyse, to evaluate, often will be something that takes place ELC, for English, certainly in humanities, in expressive arts, in science and technology, in health and well-being. So when we're thinking about using these text types progressively through school, but also in terms of depth across authentic opportunities, this grid helps with that as well. And it's with that in mind that I've invited the very lovely Bridie Davis, the curriculum partner for humanities, to speak a little bit today. She's been doing quite a substantial amount of work with schools over the course of this year, looking at authentic reading, but also writing. Are you there?
Yes, I am. Sorry, it keeps going in and out. So hopefully that's not my internet now when I take over, because that would be bad timing, wouldn't it? Afternoon, everybody. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Kat. Yeah, for those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Bridie Davis and I'm the Humanities Curriculum Partner. But as Kat said, I have been doing an awful lot of work on looking at authentic writing in humanities, working alongside her and Leanne, Kat's counterpart for the secondary phase. And it does also help that I do have a massive passion for all things English and literacy. So in terms of authentic writing then within humanities, if we go back to the text type grid that Kat shared with you, and looking at those authentic purposes in humanities, what we want to think about is how would a historian or a geographer or theologian write? So the disciplinary writing is writing like a historian, etc. So when you are considering those authentic purposes for writing, it's about making sure that your questions are authentic. So in humanities, writing is authentic, and the text types on the left-hand side of the grid that you can see on the screen. To be honest with you, though, it's not everything on the left. It's only some of the left. You can see I've underlined in red the authentic purposes within humanities. Writing in humanities, it's factual, it's real, it's not made up, it's not embellished or exaggerated. So that's why it lends itself to those non-fiction text types on the left-hand side of the grid. Now, humanities can certainly be an inspiration for creative and descriptive writing, which is the far right-hand side of the grid, like Kat did explain. But if we're thinking about authenticity, then we want our children within humanities teaching and learning to be writing for the purposes on the left-hand side of the grid. So largely speaking, then, the text types in themselves within humanities are progressive. So writing to inform is probably the most basic and simple type of writing that children can engage in within humanities. And then that's followed by writing to explain. And then it becomes progressive because in order to write to analyse, evaluate, argue and advise, you need to be able to explain. So that's why the text types in themselves does become largely progressive, but it becomes more progressive as well due to the content and the rigour of the question and what you're asking children to actually write about. But actually, broadly speaking, often the principles, the strategies, the features generally remain the same. So what I'm going to do now is go through each text type with you, or each purpose with you. It is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. In an ideal world, this would be done over several hours, but obviously, unfortunately, we don't have that amount of time this afternoon. So I'll start with writing to inform. So writing to inform then in humanities generally lends itself to how or what questions, like you can see displayed on the screen. And they're often lower order questions. And actually, if you think about questioning children in the classroom for their assessment, and we would encourage obviously to pose higher order questions, the same sort of principle actually applies. These are the lower order thinking questions. So whether children are speaking them or they put pen to paper, it's not a very challenging skill. It's all about factual information, even young children, whether that be really simple sentences, as long as those simple sentences are based on fact, they are writing to inform. This kind of writing as well often doesn't lend itself to extended writing, whether a child is in, say, year 3, or even actually if a child is about to leave compulsory education and they're in year 11, we wouldn't expect them to write at any great length. The progression with this type of writing, as I said already, is just about the rigor of the content. So then slightly more progressive, slightly more challenging is writing to explain. And when we write to explain in humanities, it does require a level of more deeper thinking, more critical thinking, because when we explain, we often explain in relation to our disciplinary concepts that are woven throughout the statements of what matters. So things like the concept of cause and effect or significance. So you can see there with the first example at the top of the screen, why did Owen Glyndwr launch a rebellion in 1400? That's all about causation. Now, arguably, that's actually probably quite a challenging question, just down to the nature of the political element of the content. This kind of writing, though, is not necessarily overly complicated, but children generally do struggle with it because they end up writing to inform rather than writing to explain. So again, though, the progression here is probably down to the rigor of the content, the sophistication of the vocabulary. Again, it's not a type of writing that we would expect children to write at great lengths with, but the likelihood is the more reasons they write about, the more developed those reasons are, they would naturally probably write at greater lengths. But it's certainly nothing that you would expect pages and pages of writing. Okay then, so moving on then, something to the text type now that does become a lot more challenging. So when we write to analyse, there are multiple ways that we can write to analyse in humanities. And again, just looking at the examples that you can see displayed on the screen already, the question stems how is similar to the writing to inform question stem. The difference here, though, is that there is more critical thinking because we're combining this type of question with the concept of change and continuity. So, for example, if we looked at the question at the top of the screen, says, how has the weather changed this week? So if a very basic answer to that question was on Monday, it was raining. On Tuesday, it was sunny. On Wednesday, it was raining. Thursday, it was sunny. And Friday, it was sunny. Then the answer would certainly be writing to inform. However, if we tweaked the answer slightly and said that actually on Monday it was raining, but it changed on Tuesday and it was sunny, but it changed again on Wednesday and it was raining, but then the weather was the same on Thursday and Friday, it was sunny. What we're starting to do, albeit at a very basic level, because we're looking at what has changed and what has stayed the same across the week, it becomes more than just writing to inform, it's a basic analysis. Now, again, the rigor of the content there, because actually that requires understanding of physical processes from a geographical point of view. If a child did have those and they started to explain why the weather changed using their geographical knowledge, the analysis would become a lot more sophisticated. When we analyse in humanities, though, we also utilise the concept of similarity and difference. So again, you can see some examples displayed on the screen, because when we analyse, actually, regardless of it being a humanities discipline, we often point out patterns, which aligns itself with the concept of similarity and difference and change and continuity. In humanities, though, another element that we also analyse is we analyse evidence as part of the inquiry process. So if we were going to look at perhaps a geographical or social science inquiry, perhaps sending out a survey asking people on the influences on people's identity, perhaps. You could ask questions on the proportion of people who have a Welsh identity or have an identity that's different to Wales or Welsh, maybe have a mixed identity. what is the biggest influences on their identity, and then you cross-reference those findings and those results with perhaps their age and their gender. You would be picking those results apart and you would be analysing them. Maybe though at a more sophisticated level, and when a child is a lot more, perhaps a little bit older and is capable, they might use secondary evidence to see if their results from their survey is the same or different to somebody else's research, and that then becomes a higher level analysis. But we also analyse evidence in history, looking at perhaps sources of evidence from the past. What do those sources of evidence tell us about the past? Which ones tell us something the same? Which ones are different? And that is also classed as analysis in humanities. We also have then in humanities writing to evaluate. And again, as you can see with the question examples on the screen, they also look similar to writing to inform. They start with how, a lot of them, but they're combined this time with concepts such as significance and impact. And you can also see on the screen, we're looking at importance and effectiveness and so forth. So when we evaluate in humanities, there are two different ways that we evaluate. One way is that we make a judgment and we provide reasons for that judgment. So, for example, the example at the top of the screen, how significant was the Roman invasion of Britain? Well, the Roman invasion of Britain was very significant because it resulted in the introduction of using coins to buy and sell rather than using trade. Just one example. However, we can also evaluate looking at the strengths and limitations. So if we look at the question that says evaluate the impact of a new supermarket on the community, you might look at the strengths of that new supermarket in the local area, but then you might also look at the limitations and the negative impact that that supermarket has had on the local area. And although slightly more challenging, this type of writing, you can actually practice the skills with children who are at a younger age, even just by things like card sorts or highlighting strengths and limitations in different colours. So they may not be able to put pen to paper at a young age to write to evaluate, but they could perhaps certainly, with support and differentiation and appropriate pedagogy, still be thinking in an evaluative way, which will then help them later on when they do come to put pen to paper. The other thing we can evaluate in humanities, though, is evidence. So from a history point of view, perhaps we could look at how useful evidence is. We could look at how helpful it is. Perhaps we could look at how trustworthy it is. And in doing so, again, we would look at the strengths and limitations of that evidence. Now, those are perhaps higher order skills. So potentially something that you may not do with younger children, but certainly with children in the top end of primary school, utilising and evaluating sources of evidence from the past is something that we would encourage not only to develop their skills in humanities, but also their writing skills. One other way that we do evaluate, though, in humanities is when we undertake inquiries. And again, this aligns with Statement of All Matters 1 in humanities. When children have undertaken perhaps a geographical inquiry, which aligns and is very similar to a science experiment, at the end of it, they might look at what's gone well and even better if next time round. So that's just another way that in humanities we evaluate. So then a lot more challengingly is writing to argue. And writing to argue questions will often allow children to put forward more than one point of view or more than one argument or even an interpretation. And I probably envisage this type of writing more towards, again, the very top end of school, because it is actually really challenging and it encompasses multiple purposes of writing in humanities. And ultimately, after putting forward more than one point of view, we would then encourage children to reach their own judgment. So, for example, if we look at the question at the top of the page. The main reason why the Aberfan disaster occurred was because of the weather. Do you agree? Well, children could argue that actually the Aberfan disaster occurred, yes, because of the weather, and they could provide some reasons why that was the case. But an alternative argument is that it was down to human error. So then they could put forward reasons why it was human error before they come to their own opinion, their own judgment in, do they think the main reason was the bad weather, or do they think it was human error? When they do give their judgments, though, we do want those judgments to be based on fact and evidence. We don't want them really to be using emotive language or considering their emotions. And then the progression of this really is about the development of those arguments. So do children give one reason or two reasons why, three reasons why? Rather than just giving, one reason for the weather or one reason for the Aberfan disaster being a result of human actions. So the more developed those reasons and the argument, then the progression. But that is very basic. This is just, it's for and against. Sometimes there will be multiple arguments for against rather than just it's basic. And again, even though this is complicated with the young children, maybe it could be done in like a card sort activity again. So you have several, if we took the Aberfan disaster question, you could have several cards that argue it was for the weather. You could have several cards that maybe argue that it was human actions, and then children could sort them, and then you could have the discussions. So again, even though they may not be able to put pen to paper because it is a very complex kind of writing, and it's often the kind of writing that lends itself to that extended writing, by just thinking in this sort of way will help them develop the skills for the future. I suppose one of the biggest obstacles when writing to argue, though, is actually framing the question and wording the question in a way that younger children will understand. And unfortunately, that is probably just something that is going to take practice with repetition and so forth. And then finally, we also write to advise. However, not all the disciplines in humanities write to advise. It is only geographers and those who study business studies who write to advise. So for example, we might write to advise on where to build a new build a new wellbeing garden on the school grounds. So in order to do that, children would need to engage in the geographical inquiry process or the fieldwork process. They'd need to use a map and suss out possible locations on the school ground. Then they'd need to visit those locations and collect data. So obviously, if it's a wellbeing garden, perhaps one set of data they could collect could be to do with noise pollution. And then they could evaluate those different locations, looking at their strengths and limitations. Before actually then coming to a decision on where the best place is to build the wellbeing garden and why, using the evidence and the data they have collected. So this type of writing would probably be part of a geographical inquiry process. And you're unlikely to ever to write to advise without actually analysing evidence, evaluating. So therefore, it's not something that would be done in isolation. Geographers often refer to this process as a decision-making exercise. You write to advise after you've made a decision on the best course of action. So I am aware that that was an awful lot to take in. As I said, it's something that probably you need to look at over several hours rather than 20 minutes or so in a network meeting. But to hopefully help you out, you should have access to the link on the screen. And I think Kat's going to put it in the chat for you as well, just in case. Where I started to compile a document, and it is in draft form. It's changing all the time. I'm adding and actually changing things and editing things. But it just gives you an overview of the types of questions and where they sort of fall into the different purpose of writing. And you will also see with some of them how actually some questions encompass more than one purpose, which often actually happens more often than not within the humanities. We very rarely write for just one purpose. So that's about it from me. Does anybody have any questions? Perhaps
I have
let's send
posted
a-
the link in the chat, Bridie, already.
Oh, thanks, Kat.
Everybody's madly reading it. That's what they're doing.
Or I've stunned them into silence.
I know, Bridie, just as people, if perhaps people are thinking, if I know that you've run professional learning around this significantly this term,
Mhm.
is that likely to happen again in the future if anybody sees this as a kind of an area that their school or maybe even a cluster of schools might be particularly interested in?
Yes, absolutely. There is intention for me to run it again next academic year. I'm not going to run it in the summer only because there's already other professional learning, humanities professional learning taking place in the summer, and it would probably just be a little bit too much on offer. However, if you are interested in this before next academic year, and perhaps you have a twilight or you're aware that there is an inset day coming up in school, then please just get in contact because I can arrange to deliver the professional learning more bespokely for your school.
There are some saying how useful that resource is. I think everybody's just bowled over there. So plenty of food for thought. Diolch, Bridie. I guess if anybody has any queries or questions as the rest of the session is going on, you want to pop them in the chat. If Bridie's still here, I'm sure she'll try and put a response in, or alternatively, we can get back to you. So thanks so much, Bridie. I really appreciate your time.
No problem. Thank you.
Off the back of this grid came out of some conversations that were going on with a cluster of schools who were working to develop writing in humanities. Coming back, fantastic. Let's just mute Alison. Okay. Hopefully you had a good chance to have some conversations about the work that you've just been hearing about. Are there any subsequent questions or queries that came up in the groups that you'd like to ask Bridie while she's still here and she's still got a camera on? Feel free.
Hi, I don't mind saying something. I had a chat in our group about the training I went on with yourself about a week ago, and the piece of disciplinary writing that you shared from Bridie about Christianity. What I found interesting about that was how brief it was, and I think
like this one, but this one, oh,
my one I looked through about 10, 12 years ago.
sorry,
yeah, that's mine. That mine is, but that's my favourite one.
Sorry, I'm just trying to work out who
I could hear I started.
need to mute.
No,
I do love
There we are. Sorry about that, Kirsty. Apologies.
that's all right. It was how brief the piece of writing was, starting with an opening sentence, more or less, for your first paragraph, and then 3 short paragraphs that were clearly informative on each section, and then a closing sentence as your closing paragraph. And I think that's quite useful to see as a model. And I'm going to try and use that with my children when we do a piece of writing about Islam, which is part of our RE project for humanism, for humanities. Sorry, I'm working at home. My husband's just walked in as I'm middle of talking, so I apologise.
Know what you mean, Kirsty.
Yeah.
So, Bridie, we shared this in the writing training last week for you teachers of year 4, 5 and 6. And as you've just described, because it's about accuracy and factual accuracy, rather than, how many complex sentences and what lovely, luscious vocabulary can we add in there, there was conversation about, the relative brevity of the piece.
Yeah, and the group that I was just in, we had a similar conversation about length as well. And don't get me wrong, specialists and humanities disciplines, we love to write, historians more than anything. But there is often a time and a place for it. So when we write to argue, we would definitely write at length. But if we're writing to inform, it just doesn't warrant that lengthy writing. However, most of those questions that Kat shared with you, and some of the ones that you saw displayed on the screen earlier on, I could equally write pages and pages to answer them. But sometimes quality is more important than quantity. So just be mindful of that, I suppose, is my advice.
Thanks, Bridie. Okay, so we're going to just move along now because poor old Hannah has been sitting in the wings for an hour and a quarter now, thinking, when is it my turn? I just want to get this over with, I'm sure. I'm really, really grateful to Hannah from Glanusk, who's going to share with us the ongoing work that's been undertaken in her school at Glanusk Primary, thinking about providing authentic writing opportunities. So, Hannah, are you there?
I am. Thanks, Kath. I just realised I've asked you to do the slides as well. I got all those silly animations.
No, that's
coming
absolutely fine. I'll just keep clicking. Thanks, Hannah.
Hi, everyone. Just to introduce myself, I'm Hannah Brown. I'm acting deputy at the moment at Glanusk Primary School. Also stepped into the literacy lead role, but I have been fortunate enough to be part of the literacy team prior to this year, and also previously part of the humanities team. So I just want to give a little bit of context to our school. So if I have the next slide, please, Kath. Thank you. So our school is a very large school, and the reason I'm telling you this is because it'll give a little bit of context to how we can do things. We're very, very fortunate. It's a blessing, can be a curse at times, but we have almost 700 children here, and over 70 members of staff. We have a very large leadership team, which means that, like I said, we can run things a little bit differently. We are very lucky with the amount of staff that we've got. We've got our AOE teams, and we can use those then to help develop new concepts within our school. Thanks, Claire. I also just want to talk briefly about our curriculum journey. And the reason I'm sharing this is because, as I'm sure is the case with lots of your schools, we've been through a period of change. We've had lots of new things introduced to staff. We are aware of a little bit of overload in terms of new things coming their way. And this journey has helped our decisions for why we've developed what we're going to talk about today. So back in 2022 to 23, we actually started to introduce our writing framework. So it's our GUPS writing journey. And we also started to work with Bridie to develop our conceptual framework for humanities. And we worked on that with the cluster. We then moved on to, sorry, Kath, on the next couple, from 2023 then to 2024, we embedded those two frameworks. And then behind the scenes, we worked on introducing the science and tech conceptual framework, which again, we worked on with the cluster. So already you can see over those 2 years, there's been lots of implementation, lots of development, lots of change. And then going on to this year, they are all embedded. And we're currently working on the expressive arts framework. And funny enough, we were joking earlier with Andrea, our head teacher, and saying, can you remember when we thought we were going to do this all at once and all together? We were like, oh my gosh, yeah, a little bit ambitious. And we've just drip fed that into staff. So we've obviously been on, as I said, like many of you probably have, a big period of change. So our focus this year is strengthening and stabilizing, and that's just to kind of make sure that what we've introduced is embedded really clearly for staff. So anything now that we kind of share with them complements their understanding of what we've already introduced, so that we're not overcomplicating things for staff, and that we're not, you know, we get that good quality of teaching and learning then as a result. Thank you, Kath. So then when we had that initial discussion with Kath and she spoke about authentic writing opportunities, I'll be honest, we went through quite a lot of messy thinking initially, because like I said, we just had a brand new literacy framework that we were working on, which had different text types. So one of them was the information report writing. We had the writing chains, which we developed progressive success criteria for. We thought, oh, right, okay, does that give authentic purpose? Because they're writing about real life context. We thought, okay, not sure. So then we moved on to thinking about more writing with a purpose. That could come through, we call it our SHINE curriculum, so it's our other areas of learning. It would be the humanities, the science and tech, expressive arts, health and wellbeing. So we have that through our SHINE work. And we thought, oh, maybe they could write something around Newport, which they share with the Newport Information Centre, so it becomes a purpose. They have something to write for. Is it a persuasive letter they write to a local MP? Is that something that's authentic? And we thought, oh, hang on, these are all done under our literacy, but these are English lessons. They help support our writing skills chains. We follow those with writing chains. We go through the process of writing, and that's the outcome. So it might complement our SHINE work, our humanities work, our science work, but actually it's still English writing. It's still extended writing through literacy. So then we thought, okay, we'll look a little bit more at writing authentically across AOLEs. So as Bridie's spoken about a little bit earlier, what does it mean to write as a historian or a geographer? And we thought, what does it mean to write as a scientist? So essentially, what does it mean to write as a specialist? And we thought, actually, that's something that we haven't really thought of. And that's something that we probably do need to develop now as a school, to make sure that we're complementing and continuing to grow. And we decided to focus on humanities and science and tech. Reason being because we'd already developed those and staff were familiar with using the conceptual frameworks within those AOLEs. Thanks, Kath. Sorry, there might be a few pop-ups. And then just a further look at that, we thought, okay, another reason for why we're doing this is when we've looked at books in the autumn term through MER, we actually recognise that the quality of writing within the discrete English lessons, the literacy, the writing journey, and the quality of writing within the theme work, there was a big difference between that. Now, obviously, they're different text types, but in terms of stamina of writing and in terms of what they were actually applying within that, they just weren't on the same level. There wasn't a lot of progression, so we couldn't see that children were progressively writing from, well, all the way through the school, to be honest, particularly year 3 to year 6. The pictures here show writing from year 3 to year 6, and actually the year 3 writing is the one at the bottom in the middle, which has the most. You could see that there's a little bit of discrepancy between the progression of writing. So we sat back as a leadership team and we thought, why do we think this is happening? One of the reasons we thought it was happening was staff understanding. Do staff have the knowledge that they need to teach the children? Do they know what they would like them to write, what that output's going to be? There's potentially different expectations. We've got a big writing journey for literacy. We put a lot of emphasis on the different steps to build up to writing. And Kath, I like what you said earlier when it was time to craft work. We never really have that expectation in terms of the writing across humanities, science and tech. So we thought maybe those expectations are another reason why there was a little bit of a difference there. And also understanding a little bit of cognitive overload maybe for the pupils. There's a lot of knowledge sometimes that they're given within a lesson, and sometimes when they come in to share that in writing, it's given that time to ensure that it's quality in what they're sharing. And I think sometimes they just want to get all their ideas down, so then what they were writing wasn't as clear as we know that they're capable of. Thank you, Kath. Again, sorry, I'm forgetting to say go and change. So when we kind of fine-tuned it to, this is what we want to look at. We want to look at ensuring that we're developing learners to write as specialists, but then we're also thinking about how we can raise those standards. We decided to develop a authentic writing team. So again, this goes back to the context of our school and where we're really lucky that we've got such a large body of staff. And this team was spread across the progression steps, and it was also people who came from the AOLE, different AOLE teams. So Laura works in year 2, she's part of the humanities AOLE team. Hannah is in year 4, part of the science and tech. Lisa, sorry, it's Lisa Bletter, I did have a photo for her. She's part of the literacy team, so she's helped to develop the writing chains. And Zoe's in year 5 and again part of the humanities team. So we all came together, we pooled expertise, and we had a big discussion then about how this could look. And we essentially, thanks Kath, broke it down into 3 steps. So stage 1, we thought, right, we're going to initially get together where we're going to have lots and lots of messy thinking. We're going to discuss, create and trial some sort of approach just within our team. So we're going to create how we going to improve authentic writing experiences. And we were going to come up with something within the team and just trial it amongst ourselves, just to see where we were. Did it work? Was there any tweaks we needed to make? That then moved into stage 2, where we would meet again, evaluate the impact that we had and make any adaptations. So we're just constantly working on a plan, do, review. And I think we're on about version 4000 of this, it feels at the moment, because we're constantly trying to come back together, think about what worked, review and go again. And then stage 3, after then they've trialed it within the team, we then come back and adapt it, and then they're going to share that just within their year groups to see then if that works on a larger scale. And then following that, then the aim is again to just plan, do review. We come back, has that worked? Do we need to make any additional tweaks before we kind of disseminate that across phases and then wider staff? And I just think if we drip feed that slowly, that's how we make sure that the staff understanding is there. Thanks, Kath. So when we were developing this, we were again having that messy thinking. I'm saying that a lot today because it really was a lot of that in the process. We had lots and lots of discussion. When we thought, what do we want to create in order to do this, we kept going back to why. Why did we say we wanted to create this? And it was to improve the staff understanding, to support staff with the delivery of it, to ensure that we had consistent expectations in what the children were producing, albeit through different text types. There's obviously those non-negotiables of skills. You might not have the adjectives or, you know, that expectation across it, but they should definitely have the year group expectation in terms of grammar, punctuation, spelling, sentence types, conjunctions, connectives. So we wanted to make sure that those expectations were consistent across. And we also were doing it obviously to make sure that the pupils were able to understand what we were expected of them. So from that, we thought, okay, let's have a little look at, thanks, Kath, and there's 3 on here. Let's have a little look at learning tools that will help to raise the standards and will also provide guidance for staff. So that's kind of the road we went down. So we actually then initially developed a learning tool, was the intention of it. I'm going to say was because I'll speak about how that changed later. Thank you, Kath. So on the next slide, we've got an example of what we created. So we created this for humanities and for science and tech, and it was progressive from nursery to year 6. But actually, the progression within that was that early years was very obviously focused. So there was a lot of obviously patterns that were obviously more modelled and scaffolded by the teacher. These came from, thanks, Kath, this is the initial one. So we actually brought this from the Talk Like a Specialist. So it's part of Voice 21 that we had resources here in school. And we decided, thank you, Kath, sorry if you just put it, just thank you. So we work together to pull out some sentence stems from that. So in that document, there were lots of different sentence stems for how people could talk like a historian or talk like a scientist, talk like a designer. And we worked through it, we sifted through it, we organised, they were already progressive, but we made them even more progressive for our learners and our context in school. And then we also looked at which ones are more appropriate for oracy, maybe we don't include them, and which ones are more appropriate for writing. And we kind of looked at that. We tweaked a few. And then I was lucky enough to have a discussion with Bridie about things, and she shared some really good insight in terms of phrasing that would be more beneficial, that would be more progressive. So we went back and tweaked that then to make sure that we kind of, it complemented how you would actually write as a historian. So we then also added in some tier 2 vocabulary, which we've been working with our cluster in developing. Every early has this part of the conceptual frameworks that we have. And it was just there to try and help children to have a deeper understanding of the words and when they would be expected to use them, so that they had a purpose to them. They were organically within their work. They weren't just an additional to. And then obviously we also had those non-negotiable literacy skills. We call them their cross-text type skills, which we would expect to see across all text types, regardless of what that is. And again, like I said, it would maybe be your key sentence types to extend your ideas, or it could be the spellings that you would do, paragraphs. So that's kind of what we initially brought together. So we would be developing writing primarily, but also encouraging talking through writing through the oracy as well. Thank you, Kath. So we, as I said, developed that from nursery to year 6. After having another discussion with Bridie, we actually then developed a further 6+ one, because pronouns was something that I wasn't aware until I spoke to Bridie about how pronouns, you wouldn't necessarily use them in historical if you're writing as a historian. So we then tried to go back and progressively develop that so that children had a balance of using sentence stems that were familiar to them, which encouraged them to write in this way, but then were also fit for purpose, where they were actually writing as an authentic historian. So we tried to progressively develop that with those pronouns kind of drip fed a little bit out. We kept some in the year 5-6 purely as they highlighted, because they were actually, for when we fed back, which I'll talk about a little bit more, they really helped with the oracy discussions. They helped generate those ideas. We've kept them in there as oracy stems, but when they come to writing, they would be expected not to use those. So it's having those discussions with class. So did that with humanities. Thanks, Kath. The next slide. And we also did that then for science and tech. We don't have a Bridie alternative at the moment for science and tech, but we need one, I think, because just to help develop that language, because it was really useful with somebody who is a specialist themselves to help us kind of guide with the language we were expecting the children to use within their writing. So as I said, we would develop these with the idea that they would be used as learning tools. And then the next few slides show how the team then used that within their classrooms. And what we actually realized straight away was we hadn't actually shared how this would be taught. They just went out and trialed it. And from that, we've actually recognized, which again, I'll talk about later, that we almost skipped a step. But they went out into the classrooms. This is an example of year 2, where they were taught through shared writing. So within their groups, through shared writing, modelled writing, they shared ideas orally, built it together, and they kind of built up their own ideas that they then also independently wrote, and they extended their thinking by, I think it was evaluative writing, this one potentially, they kind of dipped into. So it was just, they had improved the content of their writing, because previously what we were seeing, it was just simple set, it just wasn't enough writing within different AOLEs. Thanks, Kath. On to the next slide. Then we jump up to year 5, where Zoe asked them to analyse a model. So they were looking essentially at a waggle. So she'd created an example of one that they analysed. They focused primarily on the language to use. Looking back now after being on PR with Bridie and Kath, they could also look at this. They could look at the knowledge that they would like them to include within their writing as well when they're analysing a model. They then went away, drafted and edited their own writing before writing their final drafts, which I think come up next. And what we realised, sorry, it's not very clear on there. What we realised was the content of what they were writing was of much higher quality. We were putting a lot more emphasis on the process of how they write that within humanities and science and technology. But we also acknowledge that currently we need to think of ways to maybe extend that, particularly under different text types. So if we're writing to inform, as Bridie said, or explain, it might look like this, but if they're evaluating and analysing, we can start to now extend that a little bit further. Another way that it was taught within science and tech was using Voice 21 method, which is, I always call them the vocabulary, the bullseye for targets. I'm not sure if that's what they're actually called. But this was pulling the key vocabulary from the tier 2 vocabulary and the sentence stems that we created, and they used that then to make a simple prediction. But it was a prediction that included key content and scientific knowledge. So it was, instead of kind of saying, I predict that the car will go further, it extended them a little bit further by ensuring that they use that scientific knowledge. And I think this is a lower ability year 3 or lower ability year 4. So, there's still room to go, but I think that they're definitely becoming more purposeful within their writing. Thanks, Kath. If we pop on to the next slide, thank you. So then that moves us on nicely to our second team meet. So as I said, the team now have trialled that within their classes using different methods that we hadn't discussed. That's methods that they came up with, and we came back, and the feedback was, thanks. I think there's 3 on this slide as well. It did improve the standards in writing. But actually, as a learning tool, children found that really overwhelming to look at. And it was so funny because we got together and we were like, obviously. But when we were putting all of our ideas together, we kind of got it all down. We're like, yeah, brilliant. Here's a learning tool they'll work with. And when we came back and looked at it again, we're like, obviously, this is too much for them to look at. But we almost had to go through that to recognise it. And the feedback from the children were they found them really useful, but it was just way too much on that one page. And that then also supported the teaching. So the teachers really enjoyed having that there because they felt it was a clear expectation of what those children should be writing. So it raised those standards and expectations. And how we felt was we could almost complement the two, in that it became a teaching tool that staff would use to support their teaching, and they would then create their own learning tools where they pull out the key sentence stems and vocabulary they would like children to use within their writing. And then, as I said earlier, what we really noticed is actually throughout this process, we didn't actually consider the process. So how this was being delivered, and that was a definite gap that was helped when, again, talking about the PR that Bridie leads on, that helped kind of see, oh, hang on, yeah, we definitely missed that. This is how this can work within what we're doing. So we needed to kind of think of a process and share maybe some key teaching strategies, and complement it with what we were already doing. So whether we're putting that same weighting on the writing journey in literacy, pulling some of that from what we were doing in order to support the writing process in humanities and science and technology as well. Thanks, Kath, just the last slide now. So then we're moving on to stage 3, where this is now going to be shared across year groups. So in PPA, they have gone out and they've shared now within their year groups these teaching and learning tools. And staff will be expected to identify which ones they think will support the writing of what they would like the children, the outcome, what they would like them to write, how it will support them. They will create learning tools that children can then use to reference when they are completing their writing in humanities and science and technology. This isn't by any means a finished article. We're going to continue to come back together and think about how we can improve these resources. It could come out that, okay, these aren't relevant, so we don't necessarily need them. This is overcomplicating things. We don't need that. Have we got too much of an emphasis on just the literacy element of it? Have we not got enough of emphasis on that? What are we seeing? So we were just having constant reviews. Again, that plan, do, review system where we're always coming back and developing it, I guess. So we just need to think about, primarily though, as I said, how this will be taught. Whether that's really emphasising on the analysing a model, what knowledge do we want them to include as well, using that to support the creation of a success criteria, ensuring they do shared writing. And that all comes through things that our staff are familiar with because it's part of our writing journey. So we have different steps within our writing journey. So it's almost mirroring that in a way that complements writing within humanities and science and technology as well. So that's where we're at the moment. It's, as I said, by no means a finished article. We've got a long way to go with it, but we have so far seen an improvement in the quality of written work in humanities and science and technology. And it's now just ensuring that continues, that children are exposed to a range of different text types. And I do like the response to a question. So I think that's something that we're going to kind of try and embed a little bit more as well. So yeah, that's our journey so far.
Thanks so much, Hannah. As always, incredibly thorough and interesting. What I think I'll do, rather than asking if anyone has any questions now, I might just pop everybody in a breakout room just for 5 minutes, just to reflect on what they've seen. And it may be that there's some questions bubble up there. Is that okay with you? So just to finish off our session this afternoon, and extremely briefly, because as always, what I'll do following this meeting is I will put a copy of the slides into our Teams space, into the file section, into the February 2025 folder, along with the recording of the session, so that if any of this material is in use to go back to, please feel free. So just a quick reminder that our Supporting Our School site page is live and was updated over actually toward last summer in September, October, with a number of practice sharing over the last year or so from schools, but also from the team. So the link on the slide is live, and if you haven't had a chance to dip into the page, please feel free. In addition, one of the things that many people reflected on after our last meeting, when asked, what should we focus on in future meetings? A number of people said, can you fix spelling, please? Well, I can't fix spelling in a network meeting, but just to let you know that we did provide a professional learning event at the October following the last network meeting. And this slide gives you a link to all of the slides and resources that were shared during that session. But also, if you want another hour of my Lancashire tones coming at you, then there is a link to the session which might be useful to have on in the background to see if there was anything useful in there for you. So please feel free to access that. Part of the materials that we shared was the EAS spelling overview, a resource that my secondary colleague Leanne and I developed to provide perhaps a spelling continuum. If as a school you don't have something in place already, you don't have a published scheme that provides you with that continuum, we've created one with a selection of links to support materials which you might find useful. So just a quick update on the summer term meeting, and for some reason I haven't put the date on there. The date of the summer term meeting is the 17th of June. I put it on the front slide instead of the back slide. 17th of June. In the summer term, the booking link is live on the slide if you want to access that and book on for the summer. And with regards to the focus for the summer, That is in development with our curriculum partner schools, but I am absolutely open to suggestions. And what I am going to ask you to do now, if you wouldn't mind, is to use the QR code on the slide or the link that I've just put in the chat to provide us with some feedback for today's session.